Have you ever felt the particular chill that has nothing to do with the weather? The kind that starts in the marrow of your bones and works its way outward, a cold that comes not from a drop in temperature, but from a drop in your own significance. It's the feeling of becoming invisible in a space you built with your own hands, of being a ghost in your own life. I wonder if you've ever come home, expecting the familiar click of the lock and the gentle sigh of a house settling around you, only to find the silence waiting like a predator. That was the silence that greeted me. The taxi had dropped me at the end of the long gravel drive, just as I'd asked. I wanted to walk the last 100 yards, to breathe in the scent of the late autumn air, to see the porch light that my husband, Robert, had always left burning for me, a golden promise of return. But the light was off. The whole house was a dark silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. A deep, unnerving stillness had replaced the gentle hum of life I knew so well. I told myself it was nothing. My son, Thomas, and his wife, Clara, had probably gone out for dinner. They had insisted I take this trip, a 2-week cruise through the calm waters of the Mediterranean. "You deserve it, Mom," Thomas had said, his hand briefly on my shoulder. "After everything with Dad, you need a break." A real 1-inch, Clara had smiled, her bright, fixed smile that never quite reached her eyes. "We'll take care of everything here. The house will be in perfect order when you return. Don't you worry about a thing." I hadn't wanted to go. The house was my comfort, the place where Robert's presence still lingered in the worn armchair, and the scent of his pipe tobacco that clung faintly to the library curtains. But they were so insistent, so full of manufactured concern, that it seemed easier to acquiesce than to argue. So I went. And now I was back, my suitcase rolling softly over the gravel, the sound swallowed by the oppressive quiet. The key felt foreign in my hand as I slid it into the lock. It turned with a grating sound, as if the tumblers had forgotten its shape. The door swung inward, not into the familiar warmth of my home, but into a sterile, cold void. The air smelled of bleach and something else, something acrid and final. My gaze fell first on the floor of the foyer. The antique Persian rug, a gift from Robert on our 20th anniversary, was gone. In its place, the bare hardwood gleamed under the sliver of moonlight from the door, scrubbed clean of any memory. I flicked the light switch. Nothing. Another. Nothing. The power was off. A knot of pure dread tightened in my stomach. I pulled the small flashlight from my purse, its beam cutting a nervous path through the gloom. The living room was a cavern of echoes. The furniture was gone. The family photos that had lined the mantelpiece, charting the course of our lives from newlyweds to parents to grandparents, were gone. The walls were bare, marked only by faint, lighter rectangles where they had once hung. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I moved through the house, a trespasser in my own history. The dining room, the kitchen, my sewing room, all stripped, all empty, all smelling of that same chemical cleanliness. It was an erasure. I was being systematically erased. Finally, I made my way to the back porch. And there they were. Black, heavy-duty trash bags, dozens of them, piled high against the railing like grotesque monuments to a life discarded. One had split open, and from its wound spilled the contents of my life. The faded chintz pillow from my reading chair. The leather-bound books Robert had collected. My grandmother's silver locket, tarnished and broken. And nestled amongst the debris, a small, cream-colored envelope. My name, Mom, was written on it in Thomas's neat, detached script. My fingers trembled so violently I could barely tear it open. The note inside was short, printed from a computer, devoid of any personal touch save the signature. It read, "Mom, we hope you had a wonderful trip. As you can see, we've made some changes. It was simply too much for you to handle, and this is for the best. The house has been sold. Your new place at Silver Creek Senior Living is all arranged. All the essentials have been moved there for you. The rest, well, it was just clutter. It's time for a simpler, safer life for you. This is goodbye. Thomas, goodbye. The word hung in the cold air, a final, brutal severance. I looked from the sterile note to the trash bags filled with my memories, my identity. They hadn't just cleaned out a house. They had thrown me away. I sank down onto the cold porch steps, the flashlight beam trembling on the splintered wood. The chill I felt now was absolute. It was the cold of betrayal, the Arctic frost of being deemed worthless by the one person I had poured my entire life into. In the suffocating silence, a single, quiet question formed in the ruins of my heart. How does one come back from being thrown away? The first hour, or perhaps it was 3, I spent simply sitting on those cold, splintered steps, the note clutched in my hand until the paper grew limp with the moisture from my palm. The world had shrunk to the size of that back porch, to the pile of black bags and the hollow shell of the house behind me. A house is more than wood and nails, it's a living archive of a family's story. Robert and I had built it on this plot of land his father had left him. We'd chosen every fixture, planted every tree. Our children, Thomas and his younger sister, Emily, who had lost to illness a decade ago, had taken their first steps on these floors. Their heights were marked in faint pencil lines on the kitchen door frame. Now, even the door frame was likely gone, sold as part of a package deal. The silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It screamed of absence, of finality. A memory surfaced, unbidden. It was from about 6 months ago, a Sunday dinner. Thomas and Clara had come over, as they often did. Clara, spooning mashed potatoes onto her plate, had said, "Eleanor, this house is just so vast. Don't you get lonely here all by yourself?" Her tone was one of syrupy concern, a tone I was beginning to recognize as a preamble to a suggestion that would benefit them far more than me. I had smiled. "It's not vast, dear. It's familiar. And I'm not lonely. I have my memories." Thomas had cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze as he meticulously cut his roast beef. "But Mom, practically speaking. The upkeep. The stairs. We worry about you." I remember looking at him, my son, a man I had nursed through fevers and celebrated at graduations, and seeing a stranger. There was no genuine warmth in his eyes, only a sort of weary impatience, as if I were a problem he was trying to solve. "I am perfectly capable of managing, Thomas. The stairs are good for my heart, and Mr. Henderson has been handling the lawn for 20 years." The conversation had drifted then, but the seed had been planted. Now, sitting in the cold, I could see the entire barren tree that had grown from it. The cruise wasn't a gift, it was a removal. They needed me out of the way to execute their plan. They knew I would never agree, so they manufactured my absence. Every polite inquiry, every offer of help over the past year, replayed in my mind not as kindness, but as reconnaissance. They were assessing my life for its disposable parts. I finally forced my numb legs to move. I went back inside, my flashlight a weak guide. The air was thick with the ghost of what was. I ran my hand along the wall where our wedding portrait used to hang. The plaster was cool and smooth. Erased. I climbed the stairs, each step a thunderclap in the emptiness. My bedroom was the worst. My bed, the one Robert had died in, holding my hand, was gone. My wardrobe, empty. They had spoken of essentials being moved to some facility. What did they deem essential? A few changes of clothes. My medication. Did they pack the photograph of Emily I kept on my nightstand? Or was she considered clutter, too? I sank onto the floor in the middle of the room, my back against a naked wall. Another memory, sharper this time. Just before I left for the trip, Clara had come over to help me pack. "Oh, Eleanor, you won't need all this," she'd chirped, pulling my favorite cashmere shawl from my suitcase. "The Mediterranean is warm. Let's stick to the basics. She had folded it with such finality, placing it back in the drawer. At the time, I thought it was her typical, overbearing practicality. Now I saw it for what it was. She wasn't packing me for a trip, she was triaging my possessions for disposal. She was deciding which pieces of me were worth keeping. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't a rash decision. This was a long, cold, deliberate campaign. They had watched me, managed me, and then, when the time was right, they had amputated me from my own life, expecting me to be grateful for the neatness of the wound. The note said, "This is for the best for whom?" Best for them, clearly. They were unburdened of a mother and a house they saw as a liability, and I imagined they were now enriched by the sale of a property they felt entitled to. I wondered what they told the real estate agent. My mother is infirm, she's moved to a facility lies built on a foundation of condescension. They had judged me, found me wanting, and sentenced me to a life in miniature, a life curated by their own convenience. The cold was beginning to seep into my very soul. It would have been so easy to break. To shatter into a million pieces on that bare floor, to keen and weep until my throat was raw. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to lie down, and let the erasure be complete. But then, my fingers brushed against something in my coat pocket. It was my phone. My hand was steady as I pulled it out. The screen lit up my face in the darkness. I didn't call Thomas. I didn't call the police. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the one name that represented clarity, strength, and unwavering loyalty. Margaret. My friend of 40 years. My lawyer. The call connected, and her voice, sharp and awake even at this late hour, cut through the silence. Eleanor. Is everything all right? I took a breath, the first one that felt like it reached my lungs. The words came out, not as a sob, but as a quiet, chillingly calm statement. Margaret, I said, my voice unfamiliar to my own ears. I need your help. They've thrown me away. And I'm afraid they've made a terrible mistake. They think I'm finished. Margaret's response was immediate, and devoid of the pity I secretly dreaded. There was no, "Oh, you poor thing," no coddling. Her voice was pure, distilled indignation, sharp and bracing as winter air. Where are you, Eleanor? Exactly where are you? I told her everything, my voice a low monotone, recounting the dark house, the empty rooms, the trash bags, the note. I read the words, "This is for the best" aloud, and I heard her sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The arrogant, condescending little monsters, she muttered, more to herself than to me. Okay, Eleanor. Listen to me very carefully. Do not go to this Silver Creek place. Do you understand? Do not go there. They are expecting a defeated woman to arrive and sign herself in. You will not be that woman. Her words were a lifeline, a steel cable thrown across the chasm of my despair. Where do I go, Margaret? I have nothing. Just the clothes I'm wearing and my suitcase. You have a key to my guest cottage. It's in the ceramic pot by my back door, same as always. Go there. Now? Get a taxi. Don't use a credit card. Pay with the cash you have from your trip. We start creating a firewall, right now, a firewall. The term was technical, impersonal, and it was the most comforting thing I had ever heard. It implied a strategy, a defense against an attack. It implied I was not a victim, but a territory to be secured. And Eleanor, she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, touch nothing. Don't move the trash bags. Don't try to clean anything. Leave the scene exactly as you found it. We may need it. The call ended, and I was left once again in the profound silence of the house. But it was different now. Margaret's voice had altered the acoustics of the room. The silence was no longer an oppressive blanket, it was a vacuum, a space waiting to be filled. I stood up, my joints cracking in protest, and began to move with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. I walked back through the house, but this time, my gaze was analytical. I wasn't a grieving homeowner, I was an investigator on a crime scene. I saw the scuff marks on the floor where heavy furniture had been dragged. I noticed the faint outline of a missing safe behind a panel in the library. Robert's safe. It had contained our wills, the deed to the house, some heirloom jewelry, and emergency cash. Of course. They would have needed the deed. How had they gotten into it? The key was on my person, in a hidden pocket of my travel purse. The combination, only Robert and I knew it. A new memory, cold and sharp, pierced through my thoughts. It was from about a month before my trip. Thomas had come over, ostensibly to fix a leaky faucet under the kitchen sink. He'd been rummaging around for a while. Later, I'd found the small tin box where I kept spare keys, for the shed, the wine cellar, the safe deposit box, slightly ajar. I had thought nothing of it, assuming he'd been looking for a shut-off valve key. But what if he had taken the spare safe key? What if he had photographed it, made a copy? The thought was nauseating. It painted a picture of such profound, premeditated betrayal that it was hard to breathe. And the combination. Had Robert ever told him? No. Robert had trusted our son, but he was a man who believed in boundaries. Then another, more insidious memory surfaced. Clara, sitting with me in the library, looking at old photo albums. Robert was such a meticulous man, she'd mused, tapping a photo of him at his desk. He always said his most important date was the day he met you. June 4, 1968. He said it was the combination to his heart. She had smiled sweetly. At the time, I'd been touched by the sentiment. Now, the memory was terrifying. The 6th of April, 68, the combination to the safe. She hadn't been reminiscing. She had been fishing, and my sentimental heart had given her exactly what she needed. The pieces were no longer just clicking into place, they were forming a mosaic of breathtaking deception. Their concern was a smokescreen for their greed. Their help was a meticulous campaign of theft. I went back out to the porch and stood over the split trash bag. With a steady hand, I used my phone to take pictures. The locket, the books, the pillow. Then I photographed the pile of bags, the dark house behind them, the cruel note held in my hand. Evidence. I was no longer thinking like a mother. I was thinking like a plaintiff. A taxi arrived, its headlights cutting through the darkness, a welcome intrusion. As I settled into the back seat, giving the driver Margaret's address, I looked back at the house one last time. It looked like a tombstone, marking the death of the family I thought I had. But as the car pulled away, I felt not an end, but a beginning. The fire of grief was banking, cooling into something harder, something more durable. It was forging itself into a quiet, cold resolve. They had wanted to erase me, to reduce my life to clutter, and send me off to fade away in a beige room. They had underestimated me. They had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness, my grief for incompetence. They had forgotten that the deepest rivers run silent, and that a mother's love, when betrayed, can become a force as formidable and unyielding as granite. The battle for my life had just begun, and I would fight it not with shouting and tears, but with the one thing they never counted on, clarity. The guest cottage behind Margaret's house was a sanctuary. It was small, filled with books and the scent of lemon verbena, and the light was on. A thermos of hot tea and a plate of sandwiches sat on the small kitchen table. Classic Margaret. Practical comfort. I spent the first night not sleeping, but sitting in a comfortable armchair, the steam from the tea warming my face, as I let the full scope of what had happened settle over me. It was not a storm of emotion, but a slow, creeping tide of realization. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a profound, almost geological sadness. The loss was twofold. There was the material loss of my home and possessions, but that was secondary. The primary loss, the one that carved a hollow space in my chest, was the loss of my son. Not his physical presence, but the idea of him I had held for over 40 years. The boy I had raised, the man I thought I knew, was a fiction. In his place was a stranger, a man capable of a cruelty so intimate, so personal, it felt like a violation of the soul. In the quiet of that cottage, the flashbacks kept coming, no longer as random shards of memory, but as a coherent narrative of deception. I remembered the conversation about power of attorney. It was Clara, of course, who had brought it up. We were in my garden, and she was admiring my roses. "You know, Eleanor," she'd said, her voice light and casual, "with you traveling more, and Thomas and I wanting to help with the bills and things, it might be a good idea to set up a power of attorney. Just for convenience. So we can handle things if you're out of touch." I had been hesitant. Robert had always warned me about such things. "A man's signature is his bond, Ellie," he used to say. "Never give it away lightly," but Thomas had chimed in. "It's just a precaution, Mom. A safety net. It doesn't mean we'd ever use it unless you asked us to, or if there was an emergency, an emergency." They had created the emergency. They had manufactured the narrative that I was frail, forgetful, and in need of their management. I had eventually, reluctantly, signed the papers at a small law office they had recommended, a place far from the trusted firm Margaret and I had used for decades. The lawyer had been young, slick, and had rushed me through the documents, glossing over the clauses that gave them durable and immediate power. He had patted my hand and called me dear lady. At the time, I had felt foolish for my hesitation. Now I felt foolish for my trust. I saw their strategy with perfect, horrifying clarity. Step 1, isolate me from my support system, primarily Margaret, by sowing seeds of doubt. "Margaret is so intense," Clara would say. "She doesn't understand our family dynamic." Step 2, establish a narrative of my decline. "Mom forgot to pay the gas bill last month," Thomas would sigh, neglecting to mention it was because he'd offered to handle it, and then forgotten. Step 3, gain legal control through deception. The power of attorney. Step 4, remove me from the premises. The gift of a cruise. Step 5, liquidate my life. The sale of the house and its contents. Step 6, warehouse me in a facility where I would be too disoriented, medicated, or ashamed to fight back. It was a flawless, cold-blooded plan. But they had made one critical error. They had not counted on Margaret. And they had not counted on the strength that lies dormant in a woman who has been pushed too far. The next morning, Margaret came to the cottage. She brought a fresh pot of coffee and a yellow legal pad. She was dressed in a sharp blazer, her silver hair perfectly coiffed. She looked like a general ready for battle. She sat opposite me and didn't waste time on platitudes. "Okay, Eleanor. We have two fronts. Legal and financial. The first thing we do is revoke that power of attorney. I'll draft the revocation notice today and have it delivered by courier to Thomas and Clara, and to that sham lawyer of theirs. It puts them on notice that their authority is terminated. It won't undo what they've done, but it stops them from doing more." I nodded, taking a sip of coffee. It was black and strong, just like her. "Second," she continued, her pen scratching against the pad, "we need to know the full extent of the financial damage. I need you to give me permission to contact your bank. We'll freeze everything we can. Every account, every card. We cut off their access completely." They had me sign some papers at the bank, too, I said, the memory surfacing. "Consolidating accounts." "For simplicity," Clara said. "It would make it easier to pay my bills." Margaret's lips thinned into a grim line. Of course she did. "The simpler it is, the fewer accounts they have to drain. Eleanor, I need you to prepare yourself. What we find might be ugly." I looked out the cottage window, at the morning light filtering through the trees. Margaret, I said softly. I found my grandmother's locket in a garbage bag. There is nothing you can show me on a bank statement that will be uglier than that. A flicker of something, pride, perhaps, passed through her eyes. Good, she said simply. That's the attitude we need. She pushed the legal pad across the table. Now, I want you to write down everything. Every conversation, every promise, every document you signed. Every time they said, it's for your own good, every piece of furniture, every photograph, every sentimental object you can remember that was in that house. Don't censor yourself. Details are our ammunition for the rest of the day, I wrote. I filled page after page of the yellow pad. The act of writing was transformative. It took the chaotic, painful swirl of memories and forced them into linear, logical order. It turned my grief into a chronicle, my pain into a deposition. As I wrote, the sadness didn't disappear, but it changed its nature. It was no longer a weight that pinned me down. It was becoming a fuel. The quiet, accommodating woman who had allowed herself to be managed, who had avoided confrontation to keep a fragile peace, was gone. She had been thrown away with the rest of the clutter. In her place, someone new was taking shape. Someone methodical. Someone patient. Someone who understood that the most effective response to a loud, brutal betrayal is not an equally loud scream, but a quiet, meticulous, and unyielding campaign to reclaim what was taken. The battle would not be won in a day. It would be a war of paperwork, of legal motions, of steady, relentless pressure. And I would be its calm, unwavering commander. The days that followed blurred into a routine of quiet, focused work. Margaret's guest cottage became my command center. The small kitchen table was perpetually covered in documents, bank statements Margaret had obtained, copies of legal filings, and the ever-growing stack of yellow legal pad pages filled with my memories. Each morning, Margaret would come over with a thermos of coffee and a plan for the day. Her presence was a constant, grounding force. She was the anchor, and I was the one learning to navigate the storm. My new lawyer, a woman named Anne Davies whom Margaret knew and trusted implicitly, was a sharp, empathetic professional in her 50s. Our first meeting was not in a stuffy office, but in the cottage. Anne listened to my entire story without interruption, her expression calm and serious. When I finished, she didn't offer condolences. She offered a strategy. Eleanor, she said, her voice firm but kind, what they have done likely constitutes several illegal acts, including fraudulent misrepresentation, and depending on how they handled your finances, elder financial abuse and potentially theft. Our first step, as Margaret initiated, was to revoke the power of attorney and freeze the assets. That's the defensive move. Now, we go on the offensive. The word offensive felt strange, but also empowering. I had spent a lifetime yielding, accommodating, smoothing over conflicts. The idea of taking an offensive position was entirely new territory. And laid out the plan. We would file a civil suit against Thomas and Clara for the recovery of my assets, including the estimated value of the house and its contents. We would also petition the court for an emergency order to discover the details of the house sale, who the buyers were, the sale price, and most importantly, where the proceeds went. They will have moved the money, and stated, as if it were an obvious fact. People who do this sort of thing are rarely foolish enough to leave it sitting in a joint account. They will have a trail, and our job is to find it. The first piece of concrete evidence came from the bank. The statements showed a massive withdrawal from my consolidated savings account, nearly my entire life savings, just 2 days after I'd departed for my cruise. The transaction was authorized by Thomas, using the power of attorney. The money had been transferred to a newly created account in his and Clara's names only. From there, it had vanished, likely moved to an offshore account, or invested under a corporate shell. Seeing it in black and white was sickening, yet validating. It was proof. It was the cold, hard data that backed up the story of my trashed belongings and the cruel note. The next step was forensic. And hired an accountant who specialized in tracing assets. My quiet life was suddenly filled with terms like shell corporations, wire transfers, and asset concealment. While the professionals dug into the financial labyrinth, I had my own task. And had asked me to create a detailed inventory of every significant item in the house, complete with any photos I might have, purchase dates, and estimated values. This was the most painful part of the process. I went through old photo albums, not to reminisce, but to catalogue my life for a legal claim. There was the grandfather clock in the hall, a wedding gift from Robert's parents. There was the collection of first-edition novels in the library, his pride and joy. There was my sewing machine, the one I'd used to make Emily's christening gown and Thomas's Halloween costumes. Each item was a fresh stab of loss. But with each entry on my list, my resolve hardened. This was not just about money. This was about reclamation. It was about proving that my life, the one they had deemed clutter, had value. It was about honoring the memory of my husband and the home we had built together. I worked methodically, my handwriting neat and steady. I spent hours in the local library, researching the value of antiques and collectibles similar to those I had lost. I became an expert in my own dispossession. One afternoon, while sifting through a box of old papers I'd kept at Margaret's for safekeeping, I found it. It was a thin file folder, labeled simply Household Originals. Inside was a copy of Robert's original will, the one drafted by Margaret's firm years ago, before Emily's death, and long before Thomas's marriage to Clara. And tucked inside the will was something I had completely forgotten about, a formal appraisal of the house and its major contents, done for insurance purposes just after Robert's death. It was a gold mine. It listed everything, from the Persian rug to the silver cutlery, with professionally assessed values. My painstaking, memory-driven inventory now had a legally binding document to back it up. I called and immediately. There was a pause on the line when I told her what I'd found. "Eleanor," she said, her voice filled with a new level of respect. "You are remarkable. This changes things. This makes our valuation claim ironclad." That evening, as I sat in the quiet of the cottage, I felt a shift inside me. The grief was still there, a dull ache that would likely never fully disappear. But it was no longer the dominant emotion. In its place was a sense of purpose, a cold, clear focus that was entirely my own. I was no longer just a victim of a terrible betrayal. I was the chief architect of my own restoration. They had sought to render me powerless, but in their arrogance, they had gifted me a new kind of power. The power that comes from being stripped of everything and realizing that your true strength doesn't reside in a house or in possessions, but in your own resilience, your own mind, and the quiet, unshakable dignity of your own spirit. The wall they had tried to build around me was crumbling, and I was the one holding the hammer. The legal machinery, once set in motion, began to grind forward with an impersonal and relentless momentum. Summonses were issued. Motions were filed. The first response from Thomas and Clara came not as an apology or an explanation, but through a lawyer whose letterhead was as glossy as Clara's smile. The letter was a masterpiece of sanctimonious justification. It painted a picture of me as a confused, deteriorating old woman, a danger to myself. It claimed their actions were born of deep love and profound concern. They asserted that the house was sold to cover the exorbitant costs of my future care at the Silver Creek facility, and quickly discovered that they had only put a small, refundable deposit on. The bulk of the money was, as suspected, unaccounted for. They were trying to build a narrative for the court, the same one they had built for themselves, that this was a mercy, not a theft. They are trying to control the story, and explained during one of our strategy sessions. Our job is to dismantle their story with indisputable facts. Our first victory was a small but significant one. The court granted our motion for an expedited discovery of the financial records. The forensic accountant, a quiet man named Mr. Albright, went to work. Following the digital breadcrumbs, he traced the money from the initial transfer to a series of increasingly complex transactions, designed to muddy the waters. It was a shell game, played with my life savings. While the financial battle waged on in the background, I focused on rebuilding my own life, piece by piece. I couldn't stay in Margaret's cottage forever. With her help, I found a small, bright apartment in a quiet building across town. It was modern and clean, a blank canvas. The first few days there were daunting. The echo of my footsteps on the bare floors reminded me of the emptiness of my old house. But this was a different kind of emptiness. It wasn't an absence, it was a potential. I bought a comfortable armchair, a small dining table, and a good reading lamp. I started visiting local nurseries, buying plants to fill the sunny balcony. I was not recreating my old life, I was consciously, deliberately, creating a new one. I was building a space that was entirely mine, defined not by the past, but by my own present needs and desires. It was an act of profound self-reliance. I had always been part of a pair, a family, a unit. Now, I was just me. And I was discovering that me was more than enough. One afternoon, a courier arrived at my new apartment with a large, flat box. It was from Anne's office. Inside was a set of documents for my review. But on top of the legal papers was a smaller, padded envelope. Confused, I opened it. Inside was my grandmother's locket. A note from Anne was attached. Eleanor, the new owners of your former home are a young couple with children. They were appalled when we contacted them and explained the situation. They had been told you were happily settled in a care facility. They found this near the back porch and wanted to make sure you got it back. They send their deepest apologies for your loss. I held the locket in my palm. The chain was still broken, the silver still tarnished, but it was warm from being held. The new owners didn't have to do that. Their simple act of decency was a stark contrast to the calculated cruelty of my own son. I sat down in my new armchair, the locket in my hand, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I cried. Not tears of grief or rage, but tears of gratitude for the kindness of strangers, and tears of mourning for the kindness I would never again receive from my child. The tears were a release, a cleansing. When they stopped, I felt lighter. I put the locket on the small table beside my chair. It wasn't clutter. It was a symbol. A symbol of survival. The next phase of Anne's strategy was to put personal pressure on Thomas and Clara. We had enough evidence to not only win a civil suit, but to potentially press criminal charges for elder financial abuse. Anne drafted a letter to their lawyer, laying out our case in stark, undeniable detail. We attached the bank records, the forged signature analysis on certain documents, the insurance appraisal from Robert's files, and a sworn affidavit from me detailing the entire deception. The letter ended with a simple, powerful proposition: return every cent of the liquidated assets, including the full market value of the house, and a separately calculated sum for the contents and punitive damages, within 30 days. If not, we would proceed not only with the civil suit, but would also hand the entire file over to the district attorney's office. It was, as Margaret called it, the squeeze. We were giving them one chance to undo the financial damage, to avoid a public, humiliating, and potentially criminal proceeding. They will see this as a threat, I said to Anne. It is, she replied calmly. It's a perfectly legal and justifiable threat. They counted on your silence and your shame. They never expected you to have the resources or the fortitude to fight back this thoroughly. Now, they have to choose between their pride and their freedom. The 30-day deadline began to tick down. For me, it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the principle. It was about accountability. They had tried to write the final chapter of my life. They had tried to sign my name to a story of decline and irrelevance. Now, I was taking the pen back. I was rewriting the ending myself. In the quiet of my new apartment, surrounded by the green life of my plants and the promise of a future I was building myself, I felt a profound sense of peace. The storm was still raging on the legal front, but within myself, I had found the I. I had found the calm, steady center that they could never touch. The 30 days passed in a tense, stretched-out silence. There was no direct response from Thomas or Clara, only a series of frantic communications between their lawyer and Anne. Their lawyer postured and blustered, accusing us of extortion and emotional distress. Anne's replies were consistently calm, factual, and unwavering. She simply reiterated the terms and pointed to the calendar. The pressure was working. We could feel their panic through the legal jargon. They had believed their own narrative so completely, that I was a frail, helpless woman who could be easily managed, that they had no contingency for this kind of organized, strategic opposition. They were bullies who had just discovered their target was made of steel. On the 29th day, their lawyer requested a meeting. They are ready to capitulate, and said over the phone. They want to negotiate the terms. There is nothing to negotiate, I replied, my voice steady. The number we had provided was not an opening bid, it was a calculation of what was stolen. It was the price of restitution. That's what I told him, and said, a smile in her voice. The meeting is for them to sign the settlement agreement. I need you to be there, Eleanor. They need to see you. The thought of facing them filled me not with fear, but with a kind of weary resolve. It was a necessary final act in this painful drama. I agreed. The meeting was held in a neutral conference room at a mediation center. The room was bland, beige, and utterly solemn, furnished with a long mahogany table and uncomfortable chairs. I arrived with Anne. I chose a simple, elegant dress in a deep blue color, and I wore my hair styled as I always had. I wanted to look exactly like myself, not a victim, not a warrior, but the woman they had tried to erase. I was calm. The frantic heartbeat, the trembling hands I had experienced on my back porch weeks ago, were gone. I felt a strange, quiet stillness inside me. Thomas and Clara arrived a few minutes later with their lawyer. They both looked diminished. Thomas had lost weight, and his face was pale and drawn. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at a fixed point on the wall just over my head. Clara's usually perfect composure was frayed at the edges. Her smile was gone, replaced by a tight, resentful line. She shot me a look of pure venom, before schooling her features into a mask of weary resignation. They sat opposite us. The air was thick with unspoken words, with years of shared history now poisoned and fractured. Their lawyer began to speak, attempting to frame the settlement as a mutual family decision to move forward, but Anne cut him off with a slight raise of her hand. My client is not here to renegotiate, or to rehash the past, she said, her voice cool and professional. She is here to witness your client's signatures on the agreement, as written. She slid the thick stack of papers across the polished table. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, Thomas reached for the pen. His hand trembled slightly as he uncapped it. He still wouldn't look at me. He signed his name on each page, his movements stiff and mechanical. He was not my son in that moment. He was a stranger, a co-conspirator in the dismantling of my life, now forced to sign the document that acknowledged his defeat. Then it was Clara's turn. She signed with a sharp, angry flourish, her pen scratching against the paper. As she pushed the documents back across the table, she finally looked at me. Her eyes were cold, filled with a bitter, unrepentant fury. I hope you're happy, she whispered, her voice a low hiss. I met her gaze without flinching. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel triumphant. I simply felt a profound and final sense of closure. I leaned forward slightly, and in the quietest voice, a voice that was just for her and Thomas, I said, happiness was never the point. This was about accountability. Thomas flinched, as if I had struck him. It was the first time I had addressed them directly, and the simple, quiet truth of my words seemed to pierce through his wall of self-deception. For a fleeting second, he looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw not the arrogant man who had discarded me, but the lost little boy he once was. I saw a flicker of shame, of regret. But it was too little, too late. The damage was done. The trust was not just broken, it had been pulverized. We stood up to leave. As we reached the door, I paused and looked back, not at them, but at the table, at the signed papers that represented the legal end of a relationship. "Thomas," I said, my voice still quiet, but carrying across the room. He looked up, startled. "The note you left me," I said. "It said, 'This is goodbye.' You were right." "It is," and then I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them behind in the beige silence with the consequences of their actions. I didn't look back. I was walking away from the ruins and into the clear, open air of my new life. The fortress of legal protection was built, the stolen territory reclaimed. The war was over. The money arrived in a trust account managed by Anne's firm within a week. It was a staggering sum, representing the sale price of the house, the meticulously calculated value of a lifetime of possessions, and a significant amount in punitive damages that their lawyer had advised them to pay to avoid the public spectacle of a trial. Seeing the number on a statement felt surreal. It was an abstraction, a string of zeros that could never truly replace what was lost. You cannot put a price on a hand-carved mantelpiece that held decades of Christmas stockings, or the specific slant of morning light in a bedroom you shared with your husband for 40 years. The money wasn't a prize, it was a tool. It was the resource that would allow me to execute the final part of my plan, a plan that had begun to form in the quiet hours in Margaret's cottage, and had solidified in my mind during the long days of legal battle. This was never just about getting my life back. It was about defining what that life would be now. It was about creating a legacy that was not defined by my son's betrayal, but by my response to it. I knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. The house, even if I could have bought it back, was tainted. Its memory was no longer one of love and family, but of a cold and calculated erasure. To live there again would be to live inside a wound. So, I decided to transform the very nature of the wound itself. I met with Anne and Margaret in my new apartment, the late afternoon sun streaming in through the balcony doors. I had made tea, and the small space felt warm and full of life. "I know what I want to do with the money," I told them. "And I need your help to make it a reality." I laid out my vision. I wanted to create a foundation. Not a massive, impersonal charity, but something small, focused, and deeply personal. It would be called the Eleanor Vance Foundation for Dignified Living. Its purpose would be twofold. First, it would provide grants for emergency legal aid to elderly individuals who found themselves in situations like mine, facing financial abuse, loss of housing, or forced relocation by family members. It would give them access to lawyers like Anne, to advocates who would fight for them when they felt they had no fight left. It would give them the one thing I was so fortunate to have had, a chance. The second purpose was more tangible. I wanted to purchase a small apartment building, or a large house, and convert it into a series of beautiful, independent living suites. This would not be a sterile facility like the one chosen for me. It would be a community, a place of safety, beauty, and mutual respect for people who had lost their homes but not their independence. A place where their belongings were treasures, not clutter. A place where they could live with dignity, surrounded by their own memories. Margaret looked at me, her eyes shining. "Eleanor Vance," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You were always the strongest woman I knew, even when you didn't know it yourself," and was already making notes, her practical mind translating my vision into legal structures and non-profit charters. "We can do this, Eleanor," she said. "We can absolutely do this. It's a powerful legacy, the word legacy settled in my heart. For months, I had been fighting against the legacy Thomas and Clara had tried to write for me, one of a helpless, discarded old woman. Now, I was seizing the pen and writing a new one. A legacy of resilience, of turning pain into purpose, of using the resources gained from a personal battle to shield others from having to fight one at all. My own personal tragedy would be transformed into a public good. The betrayal of my son would, in a strange and redemptive twist of fate, become the seed of a sanctuary for countless others. I looked at the locket still sitting on my side table. I picked it up. The broken chain felt symbolic. My family chain was irrevocably broken. But from it, I could forge new links, new connections, creating a different kind of family, a community bound not by blood, but by shared experience and mutual support. The process of building the foundation became my new full-time job. It filled my days with purpose. I scouted properties, interviewed architects, and worked with and to create the legal framework. I was no longer a matriarch without a family. I was the founder of a new kind of home. I was not just reclaiming my own life, I was building a fortress for others, one built not of anger, but of empathy and strength. The silence I had once feared was now filled with the productive hum of creation. The next 2 years were the busiest of my life. The Eleanor Vance Foundation became a living, breathing entity. We found the perfect building, a beautiful, slightly neglected Victorian house with a large garden, not unlike my old home, but with a spirit all its own. The irony was not lost on me. I was taking a structure from the past and giving it a brand new future, filling it with a new kind of life. The renovation was a labor of love. I was there every day, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant. I consulted on the design of the 8 independent suites, ensuring each one had ample light, accessible features, and a sense of private dignity. I insisted on a communal library, a bright, modern kitchen where residents could cook together if they chose, and a garden that would be filled with flowers and comfortable benches. I wasn't just building apartments, I was designing a community. Our first legal aid grant went to a man named Mr. Henderson, coincidentally the same name as my old gardener, an 80-year-old widower whose children were trying to sell his farm out from under him. With our funding, he was able to hire a fierce local lawyer, who stopped the sale and secured his right to live on his land for the rest of his life. He sent me a handwritten thank you note with a picture of his prize-winning tomatoes. I framed it and put it on my desk. It was my first dividend. The day the Vance house, as it came to be known, officially opened, was a warm day in early autumn. The garden was vibrant with chrysanthemums and asters. The house was filled with light, laughter, and the smell of fresh paint and baking bread. Our first 6 residents were moving in, their families and friends helping them carry boxes filled with their own precious clutter photographs, worn armchairs, collections of books, and family heirlooms. Each item was treated with the respect it deserved. I stood on the wide front porch, watching a woman carefully place a pot of African violets on her new windowsill. She caught my eye and smiled, a genuine, radiant smile of relief and gratitude. In that moment, I felt a sense of fulfillment so profound it almost took my breath away. It was a feeling far richer than the comfort of my old life, more satisfying than the legal victory. It was the joy of creation, of seeing a vision born from pain blossom into something beautiful and nurturing for others. I never heard from Thomas and Clara again. I heard through the grapevine of distant relatives that they had moved to a different state, their lives diminished by the financial settlement, and the social fallout among those who knew the true story. I do not know if they ever felt remorse. I do not know if they ever understood the depth of what they had done. And I realized, with a sense of calm detachment, that it no longer mattered. Their story was over. Mine was still being written. I had chosen not to be defined by their actions, not to let my life be a perpetual reaction to their betrayal. I had found a way to alchemize my grief, turning the leaden weight of loss into the gold of purpose. My personal sorrow had been the catalyst for a public good, and in that transformation, I had healed myself. My own apartment was my peaceful haven, filled with books, plants, and the company of good friends like Margaret. My life was smaller in scale, but infinitely larger in meaning. The ghost of who I was, the quiet, accommodating woman who feared making waves, was gone. In her place was a woman who had found her voice not in shouting, but in building. A woman who had learned that true strength isn't about never falling, it's about what you choose to build when you stand back up. I wonder if you've ever had the chance to rewrite your own story. Not to erase the painful chapters, but to add new ones, chapters so full of purpose and light that they change the meaning of all that came before. That is the gift I was given, the gift I ultimately gave myself. It has been 5 years since I stood on that cold back porch, a ghost in my own life. The chill has long since faded, replaced by a deep and abiding warmth that comes from within. My life today is quiet, but it is not silent. It is filled with the gentle hum of purpose. I spend my days managing the foundation, my mornings often at Vance's house, having coffee with the residents in the sun-drenched library, and my afternoons in my own peaceful apartment, surrounded by the life I have cultivated. The locket my grandmother gave me sits on my dresser. I had the chain repaired. It serves as a reminder not of what was broken, but of the fact that things can be mended, perhaps not in the same way, but they can be made whole again. Sometimes, a resident at the house will share their story with me. They are all different, yet eerily similar, tales of being overlooked, undervalued, and dismissed. They speak of the quiet fear of becoming a burden, of their lives being downsized by the well-intentioned, but misguided hands of their own children. I listen, and I understand. And I tell them, you are not a burden. Your life is not clutter. You are the author of your own story, and you get to decide how the next chapter is written. The foundation has flourished. We have now helped over 30 families with legal aid, and Vance's house has a waiting list. We are looking into acquiring a second property. The legacy is growing, taking on a life of its own, far beyond my initial vision. I did receive one final communication, indirectly, from my son. It was a short, formal letter from a lawyer, informing me of his divorce from Clara. There was no personal note, no apology, no acknowledgement of the past. It was just a cold, legal fact. I read it, felt a brief, distant pang of sorrow for the boy he once was, and then I put it in the recycling bin. He was a closed chapter, a part of the past that had led me to this present, and for that, in a strange way, I suppose I am grateful. His cruelty was the catalyst for my courage. His attempt to erase me forced me to define myself more clearly than ever before. He tried to give me an ending, and instead, he gave me a beginning. Today, as I sit on my balcony watching the sun set, I feel a profound sense of peace. It's not the peace of ignorance, or the quiet of a life unlived. It is the earned peace of a woman who has walked through the fire of betrayal and emerged not burned, but forged. A woman who faced the terrifying reality of being thrown away and discovered that she was not disposable. She was durable. So I ask you, not as a challenge, but as a gentle encouragement, what will you do with the unexpected, painful, and transformative chapters of your own life? How will you take the pen back and write an ending, or a new beginning, that is worthy of your own strength, your own dignity, and your own unshakable spirit? Because in the end, that is the only story that truly matters.